Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves, and the only way they could do this is by not voting." In the Revolutionary War, 50,000 Americans died or were wounded fighting for freedom against Britain. In some ways, we have been fighting for that freedom ever since. During the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s, voting rights activists in the South were subjected to various forms of mistreatment and violence. One event that outraged many Americans occurred on March 7, 1965, when peaceful participants in a voting rights march from Selma, Alabama to the state capitol in Montgomery were met by Alabama state troopers, who attacked them with nightsticks, tear gas, and whips after they refused to turn back. Some protesters were severely beaten and others ran for their lives. The incident was captured on national television. We have spent centuries securing the right to vote for everyone to vote. It has not been a right that was easily attained for most Americans. When we beat Britain, we won the right to vote, but that right was only extended to a limited group of people. It took centuries for every American to gain that right to vote. In 1923, the National Women's Party proposed an amendment to the Constitution that prohibited all discrimination on the basis of sex. The so-called Equal Rights Amendment has never been ratified. It took entire movements for women and minorities to win the right to vote, such as the women's suffrage movement. Black people and women were still not given the right to vote until the 20th century. On Election Day in 1920, millions of American women exercised their right to vote for the very first time. It took activists nearly 100 years to win that right. Other policies were put into place to keep people from being able to vote. Poll taxes, literacy tests, segregation, even physical and violent intimidation has been used to control voting rights in America. In 1965, when the passage of Voting Rights Act, there were 6 African Americans in the U.S. House of Representatives and no blacks in the U.S. Senate. The act banned the use of literacy tests for federal oversight, provided for federal oversight of voter registration areas where less than 50% of non-white population had not registered to vote, and authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. Those taxes left poor people without a voice to vote. By 1971, there were 13 members of the House. There were 13 African American members of the House and 1 black member of the Senate. It took a lot of sweat, blood, and tears to win the right to vote for every American, and yet people still don't let that voice be heard. Just over half of all Americans that can vote exercise their right and go cast their vote. Only 50% of Americans voted in 2012 for the presidential election. The population of people with college degrees voted at over 80%. People who are educated are more likely to vote because they understand the importance of it. According to classbrain.com, your vote counts. In 1948, there were 9,247 voting precincts in Ohio. Truman won the state by just 7,107 votes. Had just one more Dewey voter in each precinct voted in. Had just one more Truman voter in each precinct voted for Dewey, he would have won the state and its 25 electoral votes. Almost 75% of homeowners vote. Remember, when you're voting for somebody, you're just not voting for a person. You're voting for the ideas behind them. People that voted for Obama gave homosexuals the same rights as heterosexuals and the right to marry. Another example is whether it affects us going to war with a certain country, our trade with other countries, and the highways that we create or the schools that we are funding. Imagine a country that is not working, that is working for the voice of the majority, not the money. The Koch brothers want to spend nearly $1 billion in the 2016 election. On the Democratic side, there are 7 unions that hope to top the Koch brothers' contributions. If people don't exercise their right to vote, the money will run the country. The corporate lobbyists will get their way. The average American will lose the ability to climb the social ladder. Have you heard of the Citizens United hearing court decision? The Supreme Court ruled that privately held corporations could contribute to election campaigns. That means billionaires could spend as much as they want to make sure their favorite officials are the ones who will take office. If you ever do a search on who funds Citizens United, you will fall into a rabbit hole without any answers. The best I could find is the Oxford Club. It's a member-only organization. It reports its membership of 65,000 in more than 110 countries. If you don't want your vote to be taken away and replaced by corporations and politically funded, biased organizations, then the only way to make sure your vote is heard is by taking the time to go and vote. We have covered the struggles and the tribulations of people fighting for their right to vote. You also know that if you don't vote, the chances of corporate lobbyists and the country's wealthiest people will fill the votes for you. What can you do to make sure we as the people decide our fate? We can take our time to go vote. We can make sure our voices are heard. We can stand up for our individual rights and show that no amount of money will decide our future. Since the revolution, we have been selective in who can vote, and different groups of people have made sacrifices to win that right to cast their vote and use their voice. Now that is being challenged by those greedy few who want to shape America with what they think is right. Don't let the few decide the rights of us all. Don't let corporations use your voice to fill their bank accounts. Go and exercise your right so many of our ancestors have died for. Go and let your voice be heard. If you do vote, find a buddy or find a friend who doesn't vote and make sure they fill out their mail-in ballot. You can even offer it to drop it off at the polling place. Be passionate about your country. Don't let your freedom slip away. Don't let someone else decide the future of your children. Go and cast your vote. Stand up if you're willing to get one person to vote. In 1776, our future was created from blood and fire. The future was shaped by the voice of free people. We have come so far to make sure every man and woman has a voice since then. Don't be silent. Don't let our freedom be systematically dismantled until we have no choice in our future. There has been blood spilled to give you a voice. Don't let that sacrifice be in vain.